Okay, good evening to all of you. Today I have the privilege of introducing Professor James Pescatori, and I consider it a personal privilege, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But let me introduce Professor Pescatori with regards to his works, where he worked, where he's working currently, and then I'll tell you this unprecedented piece of information that I would like to add on a personal note. Professor James Piscatori works at the Center of the History of Political Thought at Durham University. And before actually coming to Durham, Professor Piscatori has worked at several universities, including University of Oxford, University of Aberystwyth, and Johns Hopkins University. Professor Piscatori's interests include Islamic political thought and international thought, politics and international relations of the Middle East, religion and politics in the Arab states of the Gulf. And his books include Islam in a World of Nation-States and Muslim Politics. 2002, I finished my PhD thesis at Exeter University under the supervision of the now retired Professor Tim Niblock. And he asked me, who do you want to be as your external examiner? I said, like Martin Luther, I have a dream. And my dream is to have Professor Pescatori be my external examiner. And you know, in a PhD thesis, you have to have an external examiner. And he was the one I chose, and he gracefully agreed to actually come all the way to Oxford and be in my examination at Exeter. We had a long discussion, and he's a very gentle, noble, diplomatic person. But if he wants to grill you and grind you, he will do it, diplomatically as well, but with academic rigor and professionalism. And he asked me various questions about the thesis. And although Professor Tim Niblock, before the thesis, assured me that relax, don't be tense, there was this air of respect of the sort of questions that he was asking. But frankly, today, 2015, I have forgotten all the questions that I was asked, except one question that I still, till today, remember. The question was, what is it that you are aware that is missing in your thesis, and that you are hiding, and that if you wished you would rewrite the thesis, you would actually address it? And to me, this was trying to engage me in self-critiquing my thesis. I'm so privileged that I work now at AUK in a liberal arts institute that encourages critical thinking. But I think that I'm grateful to Professor Pescatori that as early as 2002, he was the one really that realistically introduced me to critical thinking. So I'm so honored today to be introducing him. He will be, Professor Pescatori, speaking to us today about religion, politics, and the search for peace. Professor Pescatori.
Lovely introduction. Thanks ever so much, Hisham. It was very kind of you to say all that. You can see I can be a bad cop, and so it's good. I'm trying to be a good cop tonight. Hisham is being very modest. It was so easy to be his examiner, to his questioner, and I have to say, and I mean this, that everything I know about the Muslim Brotherhood has been changed, evolved, and shaped by what you've written. So all of you, if you have not read Professor Al-Wadi's work on the Muslim Brotherhood, I highly recommend it. You must. And I speak with trepidation here in this audience and in this university, because not only is there such great expertise on a part of the world that I'm interested in, of course, the Middle East, but there's also been a great deal of work that has been done here on religion and politics and religion and conflict. And I just think of just a few that I've named personally. Of course, Professor Al-Wadi himself, as I've just mentioned. Your president, President Hamza, has written such important works on Hezbollah and on Islamism in general. and my great old friend, if I can say old, Professor Irani, who is the expert on the Vatican and the Holy See and institutionalized Christian religion and its impact on international relations. So there's so many here that have dealt with this subject. I'm aware of the great expertise around me. Let me also say that I have a second sort of trepidation in dealing with this subject. I normally, and in the questions, I'm happy to invite questions on it. I normally would speak on something much more specific, on a particular Islamist movement or a particular Islamist concept, Islamic political concept. This time, I tried to stand back a little bit and to try to think about the general place of religion. And here I'm going to mean religion broadly. I'm going to mean it institutionally, I'm going to mean it in affiliation, I'm going to mean particular groups, and across different faith traditions. So not just Islam, but also Christianity, Hinduism, etc. And I'm obviously not going to develop any of them in particular, but try to make some larger points. Now, since I'm afraid you're all going to fall asleep, I'm going to give you my conclusions first. And then do what you want, and I hopefully will try to develop them. So let me try to focus your attention by telling you what I'm going to conclude. And then hopefully I'll be able to develop them. Okay, there have been two long-held assumptions about religion. One is that secularism is the norm. It's the default position. It's what, in a sense, it's the kind of European, the Western European tradition writ large. It's meant to be applicable across cultures, applicable around the world. And allied with that, sort of the complement of it, is that if secularism is the norm, then religion somehow doesn't quite fit, obviously, and in fact it's a problem. Not only is it a problem generally, but that almost specifically it tends to be violent. And of course, in this day of the Islamic State, in this day of Daesh, with the horrible things that we see every day in the press, in the media, who could doubt this? Surely there has to be some sort of relationship between religion and violence. It's that I want to question and to look at. What I'm going to argue is that war and peace, in a way, are ambivalent. That religion is war and peace ambivalent, I should say. That in a sense, you could read into religion a warlike set of characteristics. You could also read into religion a sort of peaceful characteristics. So essentially what I want to say is, it's not the essence of a religion that counts, it's its functions that matter. Now this may not lead to peace. Peace as a sort of an entity, peace as a condition of life. Sort of the absence of any conflict, the absence of violence. But it seems to me that given the will, and here I'm going to use this term, religious agency, given the will of individuals, religion might be used as an instrument for good. And here I'm kind of making up a term, and I'll try to develop this a little bit more. Maybe there's no clear linkage between religion and peace, but there might be a connection between that and what I'm calling peaceability, and I'll try to develop that idea. That is, encouraging the disposition towards peace rather than the attainment of peace per se. Okay, so that's basically where I'm going, and now let me try to take you along with me. We have a whole set of assumptions about the study of religion. And I'm going to be drawing on several literatures here. The literature of political science, the literature of international relations, the literature of peace studies, peace building, some sociological and anthropological literature as well. In other words, every discipline, or just about every discipline, has had something to say about religion, and we don't want to fall into the trap of excluding these different viewpoints. But having said that, it does seem to me that there is sort of a dominant motif here. It has been dominated by this view of modernity is the default position. We need to try to explain what this modernity is, and as this sort of image depicts, it can be quite confusing. There can be many strands to it, many parts to it, and many people will argue, there are great pieces of scholarship which argue as to what it means. What is modernity? What are we aiming for? Are we in it, or are we going to get there? One thing I think that is forgotten about this debate is that it really is historically and culturally contingent. That is to say, much of this discourse of modernity really emerges out of the 17th and 18th century, and of course out of European practice. So we need to place it, and not just to assume it's a universal given, that it's there and it means the same thing to everyone. In fact, we know that postmodernists, of course, have said this, have criticized it, have said that we have to recognize it's just a part of the larger universe. But they also go further, and they say that it can lead to a logic of domination and oppression. That, and this is very often a motif in some Islamist discourse, that modernity is really a form of imperialism, is a form of oppression which is being dictated by the West. Well, true or not true, there is something to the idea that to argue in favor of modernity is not necessarily to assume that it applies equally across the board. Now, perhaps the biggest sinner in all of this, if I could use that term in this kind of lecture, has been modernization theory. And many of you, I'm sure you have been exposed to this in your readings and students in your classes. This, of course, has been such a dominant paradigm, a dominant way in which we've looked at the world. And it's had these assumptions built into it. Modernity is, of course, what we want to get to. And when we get there, it's going to lead to increasing individualization, which leads to a kind of pluralism. Or putting it much more simply, things like ethnicity, things like tribes, things like religious communities will become less important as we become new men, as we become new people, with individual characteristics which are really important. It also assumes that modernity is progressive, tradition is regressive, and modernity would eventually, inevitably triumph over tradition. And it's the choice in the theory is either or. And George will recognize this immediately. Those of us of the sort of earlier generation of studies of this will know that there were very famous formulations by theorists. Daniel Lerner, the great sociologist at Harvard, said there was a choice before the Muslim world. It was Mecca or mechanization. Mecca or mechanization. Why are they juxtaposed against each other? Why is one cancel out the other? But that was pretty much the assumption that was built into much of this modernization theory. And I can quote you other thinkers who say exactly the same thing. Tradition will go, modernity will replace it. And of course, modernity will be inevitably secular. Religion will have been part of that tradition that will be under attack. And I think you can find this in many social scientific theories. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I originally had a whole list of them just to show you how you can see this bias in many theories. I think the broad point is that they tend to overstate the role of material forces and understate other factors, spiritual factors, etc., religious affiliation. And I just give you this one example of rational choice theory, where the question before it is, how do you explain social action? How do you explain collective action? And of course, one way of doing that is that you do it by, you're motivated by perceptions of loss or sanction. You make a rational calculation. But that doesn't quite answer the story for us. And you know, some of you maybe have heard of or remember, there was a very famous sociologist called Durkheim. And Durkheim actually said there's a classic problem here. The problem is, how do you get from the individual to society? How do you make that jump? And there, you know, we have lots of individuals, but how do we get society that comes out of this? And that is part of the problem of rational choice theory. It doesn't quite explain collective identity. It doesn't explain that people may do things for altruistic reasons, for generous reasons. You know, you may do things that are contrary to your own self-interest, but you do it because it is for the good, and you've internalized ideas of the good. So we're kind of dealt a hand in sort of the academic literature on this, which suggests to us that secularism is really what we should be looking for. But I think that's a problem. I want to also point out, as I try to suggest with modernity, that it's culturally, historically specific. But so too is this idea of secularism. There's an ethnocentric bias. Putting it simply, it's the American dream. But in fact, it's not American practice. It's what people say is the American ideal, but it is not the American practice. So the ideal is supposed to be, what are we aiming for? Separation of church and state. That's good. That will give us democracy. But in fact, we have to separate them. One of the secretaries of state under President Reagan this was the time of the Iranian Revolution, and he said the worst thing that can happen for democracy is for the priests and ayatollahs to come to power. Because religion is contrary to democracy. Well, you can debate that, but to make a sort of a blanket statement, I think is problematic. And so even as that puzzle shows you, it suggests, it's not really two separate things. There is sometimes a connection between them. And you know, we know that in the case of the US, that to say that the religion is not part of the politics of the country would be, of course, rubbish. It would be an absolute foolhardy statement. So the ideal doesn't even apply to where it's supposed to apply. Okay, so now, so far, what we've got is the theoretical assumption, the presupposition of the subject is that secularism is what is good. Secularism is what we want. And then comes along the Iranian Revolution, which questions everything. How can religion be so important? And how can they actually create a new political order around religion? Can't be, can't be. It's exactly opposite to what the theory predicted. So we now have, juxtaposed with the secularization theory, we now have the resurgence theory, that actually religion is resurgent, it's revivalist, and it's there, it's important. And so we have now seen that there's a persistence of religious belief, and there's also a public role to religious belief. So we have now almost the opposite assumption. No religion, religion everywhere. Both cannot be right. Both are wrong. And we have to, with regard to the resurgent thesis, you have to put it into context. And if you're using this about Western Europe, what resurgence of religion? Yes, resurgence of religion in some way, but declining church attendance, the clergy being sort of satirized, less respect for the clergy, no longer tight religious control over birth control, abortion, all these issues. So if you take Western Europe as an example, there's not much of a resurgence, and we could talk about other parts of the world as well. So what I'm trying to suggest is that it's the thinking, it's the paradigm that we're working with. We have extremes, this secularization, resurgence. So what's the problem? What is the problem? Where do we locate the problem of religion? So there are kind of three ways of looking at this, and this is kind of summarizing a vast literature. And there are many dimensions to it. The first and the easiest one is to say, it's always religion. And I'll try not to hit it. All right. The first is religion itself. There's something about religion that gives rise to violence. Any religion, it gives rise to violence. And here we have this very famous quote from Weber. Secular society is haunted by the ghosts of religious belief. In other words, we're getting to that secular society, but this religion just doesn't know it's dead. And it just keeps walking around, and it's causing problems for us. John Bray is a philosopher at Cambridge. He's making quite a big running in the UK with his argument, which is quite interesting. He basically says, there is something about religion. If you believe, by definition, you believe that somebody else's faith is not good enough. By definition, you believe that. There's a clear demarcation between the believers and the non-believers. And that leads to a logic of escalation. That leads to a kind of intolerance. And so it is built into the nature of religion. But of course, this view understates, again, historical and cultural interpretations. So, is this true of the Muslim world, for example, which has many sort of injunctions about the need to deal with others and other faiths with respect and tolerance? So one can question it. So the first would say, where does the problem lie? It lies just because it's in a religion. The second would say, it's not the religion per se, but it's particular teachings of the religion. Okay? It's the ideological framework. And you all know this, because you've heard it a million times about Islam. Jihad, jihad, jihad. You've heard it a million times. So you know that argument is, all you have to do is look in the Quran and you will find a recipe for violence. People say this about Christianity. All you have to do is look in the Old Testament and you can find injunctions to violence. So it's particular teachings that lead this to it. Virtually all scriptures have call to arms. All scriptures in any religious tradition can be interpreted as hostile to believers. Religion can, therefore, mobilize you. If you want to do an act of violence in the name of Islam, you can attract followers because you have legitimized it in that name, or in any other religious tradition. But it should also be noted that not everyone is responding in that way. And of course, there are counter-interpretations of the scriptures. Interpretations which would say, you can't use violence. So it's not a simple game that you look at what the scripture says and then you do violence. It's much more complicated. And by the way, there's also something else you must add. You must just add the political here. You know, there actually have been studies of execution videos between 2006 and 2013. And there's no doubt that the primary rationale that is given in the execution videos is not religious. It is the idea of responding to oppression from your own rulers or external interference in foreign countries. In other words, political reasons for turning to violence, not particularly religious ones. So there's a combination of factors, a constellation of narratives. So I would say that ideology is certainly not sufficient for militancy, and it may not even be necessary. So the role of ideology, I think in some ways, has to be put into perspective. So this would be the second reason. Why is religion a problem? Because there are particular teachings of the religion. Now this is a little more complicated. This is drawing from a lot of empirical work that, by the way, has been questioned. So it's not necessarily true in every form. But the argument here would be, it's not religion per se, it's not specific teachings of the religion, it's the place of the religion in the society. Okay? Where does the religion fit into your society? And there are kind of dimensions of this. So the first is what is called unhappy coexistence. This would be where multiple religions kind of coexist unhappily next to each other. And the sociological literature says this makes conflict both more likely and more intense. This is often, in other words, ethno-religious fighting. What's the best example of this? Sri Lanka. The Hindus, Hindu Tamils versus the Buddhists. This is the example that's always given. I hesitate to say it in the presence of George, but others say Lebanon is the example. And of course, the question we have to ask is it the religion that's doing it, or is it kind of ethnic differences which are doing it? The literature says, how can you make any difference? They're the same. They just overlap with each other. You know, is a Shiite community an ethnic community or a religious community? It's both, in some ways. So the first is that we've got these different religions standing next to each other. The second is how much of control is exercised over the religion. And here people talk about political monopoly and social monopoly. Okay, again, here's the point. Is the religion used by the regime as an element of rule? If it is used as an element of rule, sociological literature suggests that it probably is going to lead to discrimination against other religious minorities. So one might give this as an example of Egypt with the Copts, Saudi Arabia with the Shia. These might be examples of this idea.
And there also says it may not necessarily have to be the government controlling it, it's just the dominant society which controls it. But it all has to do with, is everybody free to express their views religiously? If you're not, then it intensifies the turn to violence. And then the final one is the place of religion in society is isolation. Many people will argue this is the case of Jewish fundamentalists, that they have created social enclaves, physical isolation from mainstream society. What does that do? It limits exposure to alternative interpretations. And a good example is the Jewish Underground. This is the group that wanted to blow up the Dome of the Rock. And many people will argue, including the Israeli state, by the way, will argue that they have become radicalized and turned to violence because they cut themselves off from impure society. You know this. This is the whole debate in Islam over hijrah. Are there movements which withdraw from impure society, thereby isolating themselves from moderating influences? It's possible. So the turn to violence, you will recognize this, of course, instantly. I would argue that there are three factors which are important for us to know. The first is framing, and this is a term which really just describes everything I just said. That there are ideas which people use to legitimize violence. That's framing. That's an ideological cover. And I, of course, suggest that there is an example of it. You build on and give violent spin to theological interpretations that are deviations from mainstream teachings. So the first is framing. Second factor is opportunity. This is what political scientists will call the opportunity structure. Do you have an opportunity? Are there reasons for you to act? Yes, yes. Political turmoil, let's say it straight out. Failure in the Middle East, almost everywhere. And this has made the conditions ripe for full-scale opposition. And opposition to policies, secular authoritarianism, but of course foreign interventions. You know, there are certain pictures that have become iconic. This is iconic. Another picture of iconic that's become iconic in the UK is the picture of the bombers going with their rucksacks into the underground. Another picture that has become iconic is the picture of Lee Rigby, the soldier who was beheaded outside the military barracks in London. Okay, what did those who perpetrated these, what did they each say? We are doing this because our brothers in Afghanistan, our brothers in Iraq are being attacked. In other words, the point is foreign interventions. The British Army is participating in actions against the Ummah, and as a result, this is a cause for action. But it's also bound up with the problems of secular authoritarianism, all that we saw with the Arab Spring. And maybe in the comments we can talk about the impact the Arab Spring has had on all of this. And then the final factor, so framing, opportunity, organization. That we're not talking about amorphous individuals. We're concerned about the lone wolves. So overstating it, there are never lone wolves. There are always networks. There are always organizational backups in some form. And Daesh emerges from Al-Qaeda, which emerges from. There's an organizational prehistory. And all of these factors come together to create the conditions under which violence in the name of religion occurs. So I'm just sort of moving now into the last part of what I wanted to talk about. So what I've suggested is that there are different interpretations of why religion might be connected with violence, with conflict. Now, can it be connected with peace? I think we should talk about something that I would call peaceability. And here I'm using, some of you will know the sociologist, the German sociologist Simmel, and really building it on that sort of idea of sociability. Okay, sociability is the quality by which we all happily live together into some social unit or some association. And this is where, by the way, Roman, this is where sport is really important for the development of all this. Religion may not produce peace, but it might encourage this disposition towards peace, peaceability. And again, I'm following this sociological argument. What do you need? And the short version is this, to alert you to it. It's going to be a mixed picture here. You need community. Now, religion always provides community. It always provides a form of association. But it also provides new constituencies that complicate the social and political equilibria. And this that I've given here is a completely different example from one you might be used to. This is an example from Guatemala, where the North American evangelical Protestant movements made such inroads that they changed the nature of the control of the Catholic Church, and then by extension, the politics of the country, controlled by the Catholic Church, in Guatemala. So it can disrupt community as well as create it. Second element that's supposed to be present is that the differences among the believers is supposed to be lessened. In other words, equality is the goal. But religion's hierarchical. We have priests, bishops, ayatollahs, ulama. We have the learned ones in all of these traditions. And so where do they come in? And this tends to work against it. And yet there's also communication, which is also meant to be part of it. The people are supposed to be talking. But the talking, the dialogue, often occurs in interfaith dialogue rather than within. And that's because there is, as I've tried to suggest above, that partly as a result of modern education, we have a lot of people who think they can speak for the religion. It's a kind of fragmentation of religious authority. This example of Latin America is quite powerful. Liberation theology, some of you will be aware of liberation theology, I think. This is a questioning the sort of orthodoxy of the Catholic Church in the direction of social justice, the direction of development, etc. Well, this swept through Latin America. But when it did, it also questioned the authority of the priests. Why should I follow the priest, who really is just in league with the fat capitalists and with the political authorities? I really should do something else. And so they changed it. So let me bring this to a conclusion by saying that, what am I really talking about? I'm really trying to talk about, can religion be used for peace? And this is drawing on the literature of peace building, etc. Can it be an instrument for peace, given everything that we've been talking about, given the presuppositions, the complex position of religion in society? Well, I think there are problems, for sure. But religion does something. It provides an identity, absolutely provides an identity. And it provides a socio-political instrument. It can serve as a political instrument. There are positive variables that are important here. Okay, here's, and this is pretty much This is pretty much the peace construction literature which would suggest this. If you want to end a conflict and you want a sustainable peace, you want to get away from conflict situation to something better, and you want to use religion for this purpose, then there are certain factors which are present, need to be present. One is leadership. This is really important. So let me say it straight out, no hesitation. This is where the ulama, this is where the Muslim intellectuals have to stand up and say, this caliph does not speak for me. An example. Just yesterday, the French Council of Islam issued a proclamation saying, these people are Khawarij. These people are beyond it. This is just like it was in the first century. They're beyond it. That's leadership. That kind of leadership is what is needed in all of these religious traditions if we're going to make that transition from violence to peace. Second is, and this goes back to this idea of communication that we were talking about before. And you see this a lot in the literature. We need affirmation. We need somebody to say it, and say it clearly. Not just, yeah, it's not really right, is it? We need it formalized in declarations, etc. And I give you know, many of you will be aware of the Aman message, which is, if you're not aware of it, I would highly recommend you look it up. Whereby under the aegis of the Jordanian monarchy, various factions of Islam were brought together and thought, where's the Ummah if everybody disagrees with everybody else? If everybody can pronounce takfir, where is the Ummah? And the result of the Aman message was, nobody has the right to declare takfir. Nobody. This is God's prerogative. That sort of clear declaration is what's needed. I mentioned the Kaduna Declaration. Many of you will be aware of the fighting between the Christians and the Muslims in northern Nigeria. Well, the Kaduna Declaration is another example of this, where Christians, Muslims came together and declared it, and where they said killing innocents is a desecration and defames religions. Use these very strong words. So leadership, affirmation, education, and this of course includes through the media, whereby it has to be, the ideas need to be socialized, need to be spread. And reconciliation. I attended such a fascinating class today on genocide here, in which this topic came up, about reconciliation. How does one do it? How can one do it? How can one forget something as horrible as genocide? And it's obviously the hardest thing to do. The peace-building literature says you must build on repentance and forgiveness. This is easier said than done. Easier said than done. So reconciliation is the hardest, but not impossible, as perhaps the South African case suggests, and other cases which have been working towards it. So these may not create peace, but they may enhance a disposition and openness to peace. So that's what I call religious agency. Where's the will? What is required above all is will of religious and political authority and of the constituencies of those authority. It needs that. And I just remind you of this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful quote from the Holy Quran. The good deed and the evil cannot be equal. Repel the evil one, which is better, than between whom there was enmity, will now become as though they were close friends. So this sort of injunction is the kind of injunction that offsets all the horrible things that we've seen. But it requires activism, it requires agency to get that message across. Thank you very much.
Pescatore for such a thought-provoking wealth of ideas, particularly this distinction between peace and peaceability. So floor now is open for questions or comments. If you can introduce yourself and ask the question, please.
Is it on or not? My name is Mohsen Bagneed. I'm a professor of business, so maybe I'm out of the field a little bit, but just by observation, I tend to disagree that religions tend to be violent. All religions call for peace and love. I think we are looking at the symptoms of the problem without getting into the real problem that we have. I think the failure of the Arab Spring have caused a lot of problems. Religion is being used for political reasons. I think it's political, social, military injustice, oppression, all have to be looked at. The lack of education in the region, that's why I like the idea that you said education at all levels. I'm talking about in the media, the religious education, because there is tremendous amount of ignorance that we have that people don't realize that do exist. But I really think that we are dealing with the symptoms of the problem without tackling the core problems that caused all this violence. I think religion is being used, rather it is the main cause, and that to get around that we need really good education and deal with the core problems that exist. And as I said, social, military, political injustice, lack of education, all of those are serious in our region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I like the way you put it. I agree. What I probably understated, but I wish now to agree with you, that the political conditions, such as the Arab Spring, such as the invasion of Iraq, which led to the destruction of a state, politicized sectarianism, whereby Sunni Shi'i identities suddenly become so politicized and seem to be at the core of things, where they're not. They shouldn't be. All of those things are political, and all of those things, I think, created, that's what I would call the opportunity. They created the opportunity for those who want to make mischief to do it, to use it as a way. So it is an instrument. I guess the only thing I want to also emphasize is that it's an instrument used by the bad guys. It can be an instrument used by the good guys too. But when are the good guys going to step up? That's what I'm asking.
Whatever. Because we need to break around about 7:30. So can we take a couple of questions and comments, and then Professor Pescatore will respond accordingly. So one question from here and one question from here.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for the great lecture.
Thank you.
Mine is a very complicated question. So where do you think in the Middle East would be the state that would provide a model for that peaceability you spoke about between, I don't want to say religion and secularism, because that goes against the argument, but where all those sects, all those people just coexist, and violence is kind of, smoothed down. In the Middle East and in the Western world.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'd like to disagree with Ilhan's kindly. I think that religions, they legitimize violence, particularly against women. A lot of men they, like in the context of disciplining a wife or children or sister, this is also a form of violence, I think. And in terms of the solutions, the ulama preach the same message as, I would say, Daesh, in my point of view. The only difference is that they do not expect people to act upon it, but it's the same message.
Can you now a third question, so that we have them in three. Is that okay? A third question? Yes, please. Yeah, third question here. And then we'll respond.
This is not so much of a question, but as an observation. In talking about when you were pointing out the false dichotomy between tradition and modernity, I think it's sometimes we seem to see these concepts as static, not just as that they vary in time and spatial context, but they also are evolving contexts. So, for example, tradition, what is tradition? It is not just a static set of practices that don't change, but that evolve over time and that move towards perhaps what is abstractly called modernity.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Good, thank you. Thank you for all three of the excellent questions. In a way, I want to connect the first and the second together in a way. What are the conditions in the Middle East that would give rise to these changes, etc.? Well, I don't know. There are a lot of problems, as we all know. You know better than I do. There are a lot of problems, and part of the problem, and I'm speaking now generally and not specifically about any particular country, but clearly the authoritarianism which gave rise to the Arab Spring sentiment is a matter which persists. It's still there. Did the Arab Spring resolve it? No. As the professor said, it made it worse in some way. In raising the expectations and then dashing them so badly. Hisham would know better than all of us in this room. We go from Mubarak to Sisi. Have we made an improvement? Indeed, I think there are real problems here that are entrenched. And so I guess if we're hoping for change, we have to hope for gradual, incremental change over time. And I think, again, as Professor said, it's going to take education over generations to be able to develop that sort of change. And in the same sort of way, I link it to what you were saying. There's the authoritarianism of the Mubaraks, and there's the authoritarianism of the ulama. I'm speaking much more frankly than I should, but there is definitely that there. Of course, there are different kinds of ulama, there are different kinds of relationship between them. But have they either directly or tacitly given sanction to misogynist sort of practices? Yes, without a doubt, without a doubt. And I sometimes despair of this because, as you probably know, this is not just a problem for Africa and the Middle East. This is a problem in the UK. And what does one do? And it's going to have to wait until another generation of younger people come along with perhaps more open ideas who will change it. Let me just say one other thing, which is a kind of a complicated point. And I know this kind of flies in the face of traditional orthodoxy. I think through social processes, there has been, in fact, a kind of fragmentation of authority ongoing. So what I mean by that is, the ulama no longer have a complete monopoly. You have a right to speak. You do. Civil society groups, either in the name of women or in the name of human rights, the name of Islam, do. So there is a kind of social change ongoing where there are more and more people who are saying, yes, I have respect for the authority structures. Yes, I have respect for the ulama. But I also have a right to say that they're wrong. I have a right to say it should be different. There's where I find some hope. But it's like
the debate about human rights generally and civil society activism. We're talking about generations. You know, it's not going to happen tomorrow. But I think it is moving in that direction. And so there's a little bit of hope there at the end of the tunnel. And the last question, I totally agree. In fact, it's a subject on which I really like to talk about but won't, and that is that the elasticity, the fluidity of tradition, that it can evolve. And, you know, there's a famous person called Hobsbawm who talked about the invention of tradition. And in a way, there's a good point there, that tradition is not something which flows down from the sky, it's something which you construct. And if you construct it, you can change it. And you can change it by keeping the form, but subtly changing the content. And I think that goes on all the time. And by the way, in the same way as we're changing our perspective of what tradition is, we're changing our perspective of what modernity is, too. You know, and of course here I think especially of questions of women's rights, and different forms of equality. Where even 10 years ago we would not have thought that that was part of the modernity transcript, we're now saying it is. And so there is an evolution, and an evolutionary potential as well.
I think Kim here, where is the... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm sorry,
I think I
I'm trying to
see
focus
that.
in. Trying to focus in where you were.
My question is, you mentioned the French Islamic group that came out declaring absolutely in opposition to the recent events. And there have been some other Muslim groups around the world who've done this over time at different points for different crises. Now, two-part question. First of all, why do you think there isn't more leadership, as you called it, to be more vocal in affirming that? But I think the greater question is, why do you think that the media does not focus on those that have come out clearly and loudly in that camp? I think that there could be more. Why isn't there more? And on the other hand, why isn't the media accentuating those that do take this stand?
Yeah, excellent. Can I just answer that? That's good. After September 11th, the same thing happened. Yeah. And a few of us, John Esposito and myself, a few of us sent a letter to the New York Times and said, why are you missing the point that Muslims are criticizing it? Muslims are condemning it. Why do you constantly say that nobody in the Islamic world thought it was bad? And it's true, the media is fixated on the negative side. And, I don't know, I've thought about this for a long time, and I resist thinking in Lewis terms that it's some sort of a civilizational antipathy. I just resist saying that. However, it has become kind of an easy way of explaining things. It's the expected paradigm. And a lot of it, and I think this may not sound like a very profound point, but a lot of it's just lazy journalism, where people are just, it's easy to repeat the same old thing, and find examples that fit your prejudice, or fit this preset idea, rather than do the hard work. So there is something wrong with the media representations of it, and I totally agree with it. And I should have made the point clearer that there have been some people, clearly, who have criticized Daesh, etc., who are doing so. Absolutely true. And by the way, God bless CNN. I saw CNN last night that a whole new translation of the Quran with a tafsir has come out, which has been explicitly done by Sunni and Shi'i scholars, and explicitly, as tafsir, explicitly takes on what Daesh says by Quranic scripture and refutes it. And this just came out yesterday. So there is obviously some attempt by Muslim scholars, Sunni and Shi'i, together, to say, not in my name. This is not right. But why haven't more done it? I think it's partly the traditional problem of the ulama. If the regime doesn't want it, for whatever reason, you don't get it. Part of it is fear, because ISIS has targeted imams, has targeted ulama, so there's partly there as well. And I think partly a sort of a sweet Islamic ethos that you don't directly criticize. And that's kind of sweet. But it's not what's needed in this case. In this case, we need a direct confrontation, a frontal attack. No more subtlety on this issue. So I don't know, it's a combination of factors. So yes, some has occurred, much more is needed.
Yeah, it kind of builds off Kim's question and also your response. I couldn't help but think when you were giving your presentation, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs just came out with a new book. Jonathan Sachs from England, and he was selling his book, and I actually bought it because I just found the whole 24 minutes a very interesting kind of discussion about, and it feeds into your opportunity. There's a window of opportunity for leadership, and really, in much of your presentation, you talk about the bottom-up approach for the young people, and them being part of the narrative. But for this to work, it seems like a necessary condition of what Kim is talking about, and which you've addressed, is that you really need the leadership on the top to engage and become more aggressive. You know, I can't help but think of listening to the discourse or to the discussions in the United States, and how the whole primaries deteriorated into this tragic, I guess, fear-mongering that's taking place, where future presidents are engaging in discourse which to me sounds just as absurd, and that there needs to be something done from the top to take these people on. And the question that becomes is how to engage journalists, but then that means you have to play by the journalist's rules of the game. And perhaps one of the reasons is that, you know, when the Pope spoke to the Congress, I just couldn't help but think that in 1961, they were worried that if Kennedy became president, that he would receive diktats from the Pope. And here you have, in the United States, the Pope is talking to the Congress. You know, and then you have all these evangelical Christians listening to the Pope, right? So, and for some, that's like, that's anathematic to what they believe in. So, but my point, though, is that there is a window of opportunity. And the question is, you know, what you were saying is they are participating. They are, but they're not being heard or listened to. But perhaps maybe they're not participating in the right way. And there needs to be a more aggressive approach on the part of all the different monolithic religions to actually take that on.
Yeah.
You said about the fragmentation of the role of the ulama, and that's why I think what has happened in Amman as a declaration is crucial, but on the ground this might not be as impactful. And you have authored a book on Muslim media, and at the moment much of Daesh's recruitment is happening through the social networks. In fact, in Kuwait they have counted over 200 accounts, real or fake, in Twitter, where recruitment is happening. To what extent is the instrumentality of religion could be used in the hands of the young people who are actually using the social media, rather than us being obsessed with the role of the ulama, which, if happens, is good, but it's not going to be impactful.
You said it, as always, you said it much better. Both of you said it much better than I did. You both said it much better than I did, in the sense that it is both top-down and bottom-up. It's both. Now, I was making a big deal of the top-down because I just despair that it seems a vacuum, or we seem to have the unattractive ulama voices being so dominant. And so I want to counter that. And I think we can counter it to some extent by better educated, ulama, different kinds of spokespersons for Islam. But your point is very well taken, which is that that fragmentation directly leads to, in a way, a broader base. Yeah? And that has access, of course, to social media, etc. All of you have ideas about what Islam is. You all have ideas about what's right, what's wrong. You have an idea that the good cannot be juxtaposed with the evil, that the good has to triumph, and that the good has got to lead to a better relationship with those who you might have thought were an enemy. And you know, it's there, you've got it. Now the idea of transmitting that, getting that across, to my mind, this social media activism is the equivalent of what maybe in my day we would have looked for, hopefully, to civil society activism. That we would have seen lots of groups running around, acting, doing good things, improving human rights, improving the role of women, etc. All that's good. But there are all these little groups that are doing it. They're all looking for grants from America and Britain, etc., to make them do it. Well, you don't need that anymore. I'm not saying do away with it, but you can just get on the social media and exchange and develop these ideas. So I think that's important. And I think we're also now seeing, contrarily, why it's become a battlefield. Because ISIS has done such a good job of controlling it, of using it. So it's clear that the cyber warfare part of this debate is really important. But let's not obsess with the fact that they control the cyberspace. You guys have access to it too, and it's what you're talking among yourselves, which is important. So that's the groundswell idea.
So students, questions or comments? I think this is a rare opportunity that all of us should utilize. Questions or comments? Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sabah. IR student, and I really love how much insight you have about Islam. That's number one. And
Thank you.
you're welcome. But I just have one comment about what you said. You said that religion can be used for violence. I think that's very vague. Any ideology can be used for violence. I think history has taught us that more than anything. Capitalism used for violence. Communism was used for violence. Christianity was used for violence. So it's not about the ideologies. All ideologies are good. That's what I think. And it's the people who are bad in some cases.
I agree with that, and in fact, many people would say that religion is an ideology. So it is exactly that point. I would just slightly, not so much differ, but I would just slightly what people say. Religion is an ideology, so it has the same sort of thing. And all ideologies have who's a believer and who's a non-believer. But some people would argue religion has more of a punch to it. It's got more of an emotional side to it. Because whether you're a good capitalist or a bad capitalist has nothing to do whether you're going to burn in hell. But you might burn in hell if you're a bad Christian or a bad Muslim.
It depends what's your definition of hell. You have Guantanamo Bay, that's hell. In America you have the Gulag when Stalin was ruling.
True. Yeah.
Those are like definitions of hell on earth.
Okay, I defer to you. You mentioned more. It's good.
Okay. Any more questions?
Good point.
Yes, questions? Yes, please.
Okay, so I just find it very interesting how the social ideology would be the ultimatum having secularism to be the final step in our evolution, that secularism will take over, society will cease to need religion, and we'll all just live under one ethnic ideal or one ethnic principle. The sort of humanity accomplished it, not a religion, not an ethnicity, not a sect, not a whatever. I find that intriguing because the way I was brought up, I'm a Shia, the way I was brought up and to interpret religion is that it corresponds and works hand in hand with civil law and civil principle. And that at a given point, civil law and principle will draw a line and draw a border saying religion cannot cross this point. Religion, as I practice Shia belief, there's a certain extent in which Sharia law can be practiced before it oversteps civil law. We can no longer go out on the street and start cutting people's heads off or lashing them publicly. There's a certain limit that civility and civil law imposes on religion. And I thought that was very interesting how the norm was that secularism would just take over and wash away religion, instead of religion having a stop at one point.
Right. Well, you know, it's well put, and many people would argue that you won't be able to have a system such that civil law is the kind of regulating mechanism of society without secularism. I mean, that's the general argument. That essentially, you know, what you've got to do is you've got to keep these things and put them in the private realm. You create a public realm which is somehow freed of these particularistic affinities. That means that you're no longer a Muslim, you're no longer a Shia, you're no longer a Sunni, you're no longer a Jew or a Christian, you're a citizen. And the citizenship, the theory, the ideal would hold that it somehow strips of that. But we know that that doesn't exist in practice. And it probably, people don't shed these identities. And also, why logically or in practice is it impossible to be a Shiite and a citizen together? So I agree with you, and but I think that you find it curious that that's the way it was. I do too. But that's this whole kind of Weberian approach, that a society to function will have certain civil laws, will have certain standards, but that's a public realm which is freed of these ghosts, the ghosts of religion. That's rubbish. But it has somehow become the modern ideal. And so, again, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it doesn't make sense to me, but you should also question it just simply as a product of a particular history. There's no universal truth here. It's not universal. It didn't descend from the sky. It's not written into the heavens. It's a historical, cultural, contingent point. And that has become sort of told to us, it's been passed on to us as something as if it were universal, as if it came down from the heavens. So I share your concern about how did it happen.
Further questions or comments? Further questions, comments? Final question or comment? Can I make a last question?
Go.
Now, you wrote Islam in the World of Nation States, and that was decades ago, whereby the main argument is that Islam and Islamist discourse is compatible with the new concept of the nation state. Of course, you wrote this book ages ago, before the emergence of Daesh, which actually, part of its legitimacy is to undermine the concept of the nation state.
Yes, very good.
Now, if you were to write a second edition, not only Daesh, but even the moderate Islamists that you have discussed after the Arab Spring have been discredited, which perhaps have impacted negatively on people like yourself, Pescatore, and others when they try to sell to the American administration that there are moderates as opposed to extremists. What we are seeing today is that the extremist voice is taking the louder voice, perhaps. So my question to you, if you were to have written a second edition, would the emergence of Daesh created a paradigm shift in your book?
No, and I'll tell you why. And this mischievous question, by the way. Very mischievous. but I allow you this mischievous question. No, it's a very good question. I mean, I suppose what I was trying to argue is that any supposed antagonism
built-in antithesis between Islam and the kind of modern world doesn't exist. I mean, that's the general gist of what I've been arguing. And that's sort of what I was arguing there, taking the case of the nation state. So it's not that I'm particularly wedded, nor do I think Islam is particularly wedded to the idea of the nation state structure. It's just that it was the prevailing structure of international relations, and that Islam wasn't the problem. I agree. But there's always been a strand of thinking, sort of an ummah strand of thinking, yeah, which has always questioned that and said there's something else. There's something else. Right, if you ask me, what am I working on right now? I'm working on the concept of the ummah, okay? And I think I'll try to answer it by this way. All of you think the ummah is important, but can you tell me what it is? Now, I'm not trying to be deliberately provocative or offensive. I merely mean this, that a concept which is used to juxtapose or to say that the nation-state system or the particular system that we have is wrong has to be replaced by something else, and that something else is brotherhood, unity, comprehensiveness, etc. That's all well and fine. Then what do we do with sectarian differences? What do we do with all the kind of differences that have occurred? Many will say, but it doesn't matter. That really what matters is that we are all Muslim, accepted. There is a brotherhood. There is a spiritual brotherhood, accepted. But does it translate into a political brotherhood? No. Will it? Not in your lifetimes as well as mine. But it nevertheless can stand as an ideal which juxtaposes it. So I think that's there, and I think that to acknowledge the attractiveness of the ummah as an idea does not say to us that the current system is destined to go away.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Pescatori, for a thought-provoking lecture, and we hope to see you again soon.
Please.
Thank you so much.